There is a term called communicator's fallacy. If the leader spoke strongly and listeners think that they will listen more weight or more credibility. If the speaker speaks more passionately, they think that it's more concentrated or more intensive or better communicated. However, this is all a mistake on the speaker's reality. Because if the speaker speaks strongly, the listeners will close their ears or their minds. If the speaker is too passionate, the listener will become cold. Of course, when the heart is open to the speaker, being strong and compassionate, it does and becomes very effective. And usually, it is the heart of the speaker, and it is the heart of the speaker, the heart of the listener. It is saying basically it is different. And really, it is really the difference here. And this is called the communicator's fallacy. I don't think you've listened to this before, right? And I have invented this term. It's called Joseph Kim's. Jesus talked to his disciples about his cross and death. And the cross and death is a very important. However, it is the culmination of years of ministry, the focal point of his ministry, and this is the seriousness of Jesus that wanted to communicate to his disciples. He wanted the disciples to be interested, listen, and intensely listen to this, and not as some story, but what is going to happen. And the disciples has a special relationship with Jesus, and Jesus made the atmosphere of people closest to him that natural to him, and he expected them to fully understand what they're doing. In fact, he went and listened to the confession of their faith. And he says, I'm going to die on the cross. And as Jesus spoke to his disciples, Jesus created a special atmosphere. In fact, he created the confession of faith at Caesarea Philippi. And then he took the disciples, went up to the Mount of Transfiguration. And this is right after that. And this is in 30 and 31. It says, they went on from there and passed through Galilee. And they did not want to talk to anyone to know. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when they kill him, after 3 days he will arise. And in fact, when you see this, Jesus was passing through the crowds. And the flock would gather around him like a cloud. And the crowds would actually be so busy trying to get healed from their sickness. However, at this time, Jesus decides not to tell anyone, quietly passed through Galilee, and he wanted to spend time alone. He didn't want anyone to bother him because he was focused here. He wanted to spend his time with his disciples, and he did not want to be disturbed or be occupied with anything at all. But was really talking about the cross and his death to his disciples. And at this scene shows how much effort and care Jesus put into this. However, Jesus' disciples did not realize Jesus' deep heart and the efforts at all, and completely ignored him. And he totally ignores him. This is verse 32. And it says this, but they did not understand this saying, and were afraid to ask him. And what's the attitude here of the disciples? And this is not only ignorance, but the ignorance of the mind coexists here today. And it's actually true ignorance and actually ignoring what Jesus is saying. Both of these things existed. The disciples did not understand Jesus' death and resurrection. This is understandable that they couldn't realize this, that they didn't think about Jesus dying. They were thinking about Jesus ruling. And so when Jesus talks about it, is that they didn't understand that. So that ignorance could be somewhat understood. They could be ignorant to that because they've never thought of it and they've never experienced it. So this is ignorance that they have in that they did not know. However, They were afraid to ask him, it says. This shows intentional ignorance. It means that they ignored what Jesus is saying. They weren't even listening to what Jesus was saying. It meant that they clearly felt something serious in Jesus' words and atmosphere. However, they didn't even ask. They should have said, Jesus, what are you talking about? This is something we don't understand. This is something difficult for you. However, the fact that they did not ask of his intentional ignorance. They ignored it. Why didn't they didn't ask? Because they were afraid to ask him. So what were they really afraid of? They were afraid of their dreams and plans would go up in smoke. So they couldn't ask this question. They were afraid that the success in life that they would gain through Jesus would disappear. So they tried to pretend not to know. And in fact, we do that too. And I'm sure children do that. They say, Mom, can I go to this? And can I go? They don't ask those things because they're afraid that the parents will say no. It's kind of difficult. They should ask, but they don't ask their parents because the parent's going to say, you cannot go, right? They're afraid of the negative answer. So they pretend not to know. And they turned away and they kept silent. And it is not that they didn't want to know, but they did not really ignored what they wanted to know. And this is really a bad behavior. They completely ignored Jesus' heart. The intense pain and suffering that Jesus was going through, the hardship that Jesus was going through, they were only focused on what they wanted. The disciples were like immature children. You know, immature children don't like their parents to be sick. You know why? Because it's not the mothers will be difficult or it's so that the children cannot play. My mom's sick. I can't go outside and play. They didn't want that. And because they couldn't do what they want to do, and the children, they have to drag their mothers outside. They say, Mom says, I'm okay. They really believe that. They know that mom's still sick because they have the intensity of what they want to do and play outside. They ignore the illness of their mother. And the disciples' misdeeds didn't stop at ignoring Jesus' pain and suffering. They even fought with each other on the way from Galilee to Capernaum. And let's look at verse 33 and 34. And it says this, and when they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, they asked, what were you discussing on the way? They kept silent, for on the way they had argued to one another who was to be the greatest. And how can this be really something that is possible? Jesus is seriously talking about his death. This is for the second time. So even they could ask or not ask Jesus directly. Wouldn't it be normal for them to ask and worry about what Jesus was talking about for themselves and among themselves? However, the disciples were not interested in Jesus' suffering, but fought amongst themselves for their own position within the Jesus' group. And really, what place that they were trying to fight for? They fought over who would have the greatest share and who would have the better things in Jesus' rule. And what would you think if you were finding yourself into this? That you're in a difficult situation, your heart is grieved, and you tell someone something, and then when you're driving, let's say, and they don't even ask anything about that. And they just ask what they can get from you. Think about that. How would you feel? The disciples' attitude made just everything boil over at this time. How could no one worry about Jesus' understanding and feelings when Jesus was talking about his death? And there was not one person that would actually come out and say, what is wrong, Christ? And this is the second time that Jesus is talking about his death. In fact, he's created a time alone with his disciples on purpose to talk about this. So if they considered the incident in Caesarea Philippi occurred during the Feast of Tabernacles. This was only 6 months before the crucifixion. Even if we cannot fathom Jesus' feelings, shouldn't we not fight over the seat or fight over the position? My father passed away in 2006. He was here in the United States because he's not going to live that long. He wanted to go to Korea. And he was actually in the hospital in intensive care. And my father, right after he arrived there, he says, "Can you put me in the wheelchair and take me out of this hospital room?" He didn't want to stay in the room at that time. So I asked my father, "Why would you want to do?" And many people, all the people were terminally ill in this room. But he saw their children who often visited. Children who usually didn't care about their parents came in droves. But they said that they didn't care about how the parents were, what they're feeling, and how he was feeling. Then not much talk was about that, but they were fighting over the inheritance between themselves from their parents in front of a dying person. And every time they came, they fight over this, and he's seeing this. He goes, he didn't want to stay in that room. And says, "Take me in a wheelchair and get me out of here. Get me out." How can a person be like this? This is a person that can do this. This is a person. This is a human being. And if this is a parent who's given birth to them and raised them, what can they do not to their teacher Jesus, who wanted to spread the gospel, save souls, and raise disciples? Must know these people. When we, in terms of seeing this, you should realize what kind of a behavior, what kind of a human nature that we have, and how evil we have, and the evilness of our hearts, and that we and the people who are under the rule of Satan, how difficult and how evil their hearts and actions can be. And why does the Bible show this kind of behavior of the disciples? To insult the disciples? No. Jesus himself shows how difficult it is to save a soul and make a disciple. The process of saving a sinner, making a disciple, is not some romantic action. And that Jesus is going to come back, and in fact, he's going to rule over everything. Everything's going to be very fruitful. No, and they only talk about one side, but really the fight of sin in face of the fallen human nature is difficult. And this one soul, we have to fight the sin of the nature of human beings and the fallenness and natures of human beings. And we must disciple them and have patience with them. And we have to understand and see all the evilness of our nature. And if we do not know the gospel, living according to our own desires is almost like living with animals. And if this is the state of the Jesus disciples, we can just guess the state of just ordinary people like us. And how can, Pastor, I'm praying for this person, how can this human being do this to me? And I say, that's human nature. That is the person itself. And you are trying to take these people and then try to train them in the gospel, trying to bring them. And we were the same way, and we are the same way. And then you don't understand the gospel. The resurrected Jesus told us to spread the gospel to all the people and make disciples of all nations. This is something that we must not rely on the power of the Holy Spirit. And this means that is something that Jesus, who had all the authority of heaven and earth, we must do together. It is not something that we can do with our own strength, with our own experience, with our own wisdom. This means that it is not something that it can be done with our own love, sincerity. In addition, spiritual attacks are severe. We must fight to save souls. And this is why when we do these types of projects and when we bring people to Christ, we want to pray for them, and we have to continually pray for them, watch over them, so that Christ will do the work. The Spirit will do the work in their hearts. Soul salvation and disciple making cannot be achieved through human relationship and just love alone. How much did Jesus treat his disciples and all the people around him, all the human beings? How many miracles did he show them? Yet his disciples came thoroughly selfish in the face of their own desires. Jesus handpicked these disciples and really brought them up, trained them for the last 2.5, 3 years. And anyone in one point, total betrayal and pain that they caused. And this is the nature of human beings. And so if you're loving souls and you're trying to raise them as disciples, you cannot help but experience the pain of betrayal. It is not because of the work is less diligent, because the lack of ability, or because it cannot give any more love. It is because of the fallen nature of human beings. And so we pray for them, and we do this, and then you actually retrieve or you feel the betrayal instantly. And if you don't go through this, you cannot change and bring souls to Christ. So it is not something we didn't do it. It is not the love that we didn't give. It is not the ability that it didn't do it. And so you could say, if I loved them a little bit more, if I had a little more patience, if I had a little more diligence or more ability, it is not that at all. It is not the love that you give. This is the fallen nature of human beings. So sometimes, and I meet a lot of people like this. It says, Pastor, this is so frustrating. And even an elder, if it was an elder, would he do that to me? And he ignored me. This is total ignorance in me. And then would they do that? I helped him so much. If I was a pastor, would he do that? Would he do that? Of course they would do that. Of course, this is human. And a few days ago, a pastor came to me. He says, Pastor, I'm just so frustrated. If I was a big pastor or a big church, would they do that to me? Of course, I said. That's not the issue. It is the nature of human beings. So when does it change? We must meet the resurrected Jesus. Not in the fleshly Jesus, not in the fleshly Jesus. It's the gospel that has to come, and the Jesus becomes Christ in our lives and in our hearts. It begins with the love and concern, but it is not completed with love and concern. It completed within the gospel, and it is not some help and love. And what does it complete it? It is the gospel that completes the soul. And regardless of how much you pour the person, and the Jesus gospel has to come into their hearts, come into their lives, and becomes the gospel realization and Christ. And they must meet spiritually in whole Jesus Christ. The church must have love and concern. We must embrace love and be together. However, if it doesn't have this in the church, we cannot do this. We cannot have that. We have to have that. However, it must not stop there. It must not stop there. It must advance the gospel. The gospel has to be heard, to be known and believed in Christ, and knowing Jesus who conquered sin and death and Satan. We must know that. So we must fight in the spiritual battle against sin and Satan in the name of Jesus. We must fight against our own sinful desires. We must discover how sinful nature and the fight of the gospel. And so we and so we can live a life in the power of Christ. And the church has to continue and go to the end of the gospel. We must understand and discover that it starts with love. It starts with consideration. It starts with concern. And the church programs are good, and everything is great. It cannot stop there. It completed with Jesus when they meet Christ fully through the gospel, and how great these sins are in our lives through Jesus and meeting of Jesus. And we must realize this and meet Jesus in the complete gospel. And when we realize this, we can pray for our children. And through the fight of this spiritual battle, then we can pray for these others, and we could understand what we need to do. And yes, we do start, yes, it starts with love and concern, but it ends with completely of meeting of Jesus. So here today, when they arrived in Capernaum, Jesus asked the disciples, "What have you been talking about on the road?" You think Jesus did not know what the disciples was fighting over on the road? But he asked them anyway. He knowingly asked them. And this is saying, and the disciples, knowing that, kept silent. But they did not answer. They did not. It was too embarrassing for them to say with their own mouth or fighting with their seed. However, we see Jesus here continually teaching his disciples to the word until the end. It says, why did he not give up on his disciples and say, "I'm not going to teach you anymore"? It is because Jesus knew what kind of human beings that they were. And I would be so sick and tired of them. But Jesus completely understands the human nature and the betrayalness of it, the heart of the human mind. And in fact, all the things that they've taught, in one instant, they could flip over. However, Jesus knew that. Let's look at verse 35 today. And Jesus continually teaches. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and serve all." And really, in terms of your heart of trying to be higher, you need to be, and Jesus teaches them, that is like feeble. That you have to be humble. You have to be last to be first. If you want to be first, you have to be humble and serve that person. And he humbled the position of God's equal to a servant. And who's he talking about? He's talking about Jesus himself. You know, Jesus came humbled from heaven to earth. And he became a really equal to God. One God, triune God, came down to be a servant. How humble? He humbled to the point of cross and death. But he did not end there. There is someone who exalted him. And this is the gospel. And you're going humble, humble, and it says die. That's not the gospel. Then everybody is going to die feebly. However, God exalts him. And God the Father exalts the person, exalts Christ, and everything comes under the name of Christ. Who did that? And everything bows down before Christ. But God puts him in his exalted position. And Jesus did not exalt himself, but God exalted him. The principle is important. And this is the gospel, that we are to humble, and God exalts us. God exalts us. We humble ourselves and God exalts us. We die, but who saves us? And that God gives us life and gives us life in abundance. And this is what God does in exalting us. The disciples, on the opposite hand, try to exalt themselves through using Jesus. And the world is very similar today. They try to exalt themselves by using Jesus. They talk as if about the gospel. They talk about the gospel. But no. And gospel is not what we exalt by using Jesus, but it is Jesus exalting us. And through Jesus, they want to succeed. And using Jesus, they want to be famous. They want to be a better person or a bigger person. And they believe that God's going to get glorified by that. That is not the gospel. God must acknowledge and raise them up through the following of their word as we lower ourselves. Who raises us up? God raises us up. You know, when the disciples started to talk about this, and this is such a pointless fight, they did not become higher because they were in this fight, but as they get a better position, or they even get bigger things. But God must acknowledge and raise them. What did they ask them? It says, when you get into this glory position, put him on the right, put me on the right, put him on the left of your side. And Jesus says, you have no idea what you're asking for. And what Jesus say? And then, can you drink the drink that I'm about to drink? They said, sure, I can do that. They don't even know that they're going to have to be crucified and died on the cross. And they just say yes. They don't even know what they're asking for. And so as we become high and lifted up, is that it? They don't even know what that really truly means. About a week ago, after the Friday evening service, I became very depressed after giving a sermon. It was because I completely ruined the sermon. I couldn't get it right. While giving the sermon, it seems like the congregation was receiving it. And it seems like everything went back and everything went out of whack. It looks like I just shuddered and sweat profusely out of that. And in fact, I didn't see the prayer fervently after the sermon. It seems like all this has started to attack me. I'm just giving you some information about myself, and so you can pray for me, obviously. And I was so frustrated after the sermon. And it seems like the congregation quickly left after they have received or the sermon. And what are you trying to do? What kind of a ministry are you trying to do? And in fact, the week after, I'm going to do a seminar on sermons. What are you thinking? What are you doing? And I was just very frustrated with myself. And it was so difficult. And once the sermon is not very well, for the whole week I'm suffering. And this is very suffering for me. And it attacks me. And that week, that Friday after, a person came to me. He said that sermon last Friday night changed my entire life. And that person, he says, I have to express something in gratitude to you, Pastor. And he gave me a present. And that's important. You know, I thought I completely ruined everything. And in fact, I was really just criticizing myself, and I was going and how stupidity of my ignorance here. But someone said that it changed their life. And I'm continually thinking about what I said and going over and over. And the working of God is different. It does not matter what I did well or not. It is not something that I am satisfied with. But God must work. God has to do the work. It is not the magnificent thing that we do. It has nothing we do. That's not important at all. God must have done the work. Jesus holding a little child explains this. This is in 36:37. And it says this, and he took a child, put him in his midst of them, and taking him in his arms, and he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives he not me, but him who sent me. And in the name of Jesus, it is not the work that you do and the great things that do and the many things that you do, that in fact, if you just receive a small child, it is doing the work of God. It is receiving God. It is welcoming Christ, welcoming God. And we think that we have to do something great. And we think we have to do something very difficult. Who are little children? They are the smallest. They are the weakest. In fact, there are people that even if you help them, there's no benefit that you receive. And these are children. People want help. And who they help, they want return some benefit. And what do they want to help? They want to help not the difficult, but people who are successful and famous people, right? People want to do that, right? And this is why they make all these groups to help the people. And this is the heart of the people, right? It is not to help the weak. You don't need to help the famous and the rich or success, but you want to help them. And if somebody is weak and poor and they want to help, you ignore them. But if something famous says, hey, I want your help, they return everything and help them, right? Don't do that, is what we're saying. And when God, do the things that God is asking you to do. You know, Jesus had fellowship with the religious leaders and gave them what they needed. If he received them in a great deal in return, then he would have been great understanding. And his life would have been great, right? But he didn't do that. He did completely opposite. He took care of tax collectors, prostitutes, the poor, who had no reward at all. And when the people of this world do it all, and what they do alike, and everything that they want to do, and that is not the work of God. And you can do it with money. And you can do it with the human power. Should the church be doing that? And what the great businesses of the world do it. And what the people of great gathering. Should the church, because they have money, because they have many people, should they do that? Why? It's just people do it in the world. And they all do that. All the politicians do that. What the church should do, we have to do what a church can do. It is to deliver the gospel. And we must deliver the gospel. It is to spread the gospel. It is to teach and make disciples. This is what a church should do. My beloved, it is not, don't do things that are important, great, but do what God needs, what God has called us to do. And this is what we need to do at church and any place else. This is what we need to do. It is not the place that you want to go, but you have to get to places where God is going to help you. And this is the place of life, spiritual life. And this is where people are needed. And this is where people are needed. You ask God to be sent there. And it's not the great work, and it's not the great position. It is not something that you want to do at all. And yes, in the world, you might get a lot of credit for that, but that may be not what God is wanting you to do. When God needs you, and through the work of God, he calls you, and to be in that spot is the greatest blessing. And if you don't realize this, our life continually kind of roll over in frustration for greater things, better things. And we want to get into better positions. And what am I doing here? I'm not doing this great position. Go to that position. You think that you'll be satisfied there? No. Do you think that there will be some completeness there in that position? Not at all. You go to some crazy mind. However, when God needs you and says, come, you need to be here, there's great joy. And God fills you with grace and completeness. So I hope, my beloved, today, that it is not a place that you want to be, but you be in a place that God has called you to be. It is not our church to go to a place where we want to go, but our church be used by God and called by God. And I bless you. Let us all sing together.